Good morning. With that, I'll call to order the special meeting of council for Tuesday, March 19th. There's only one item on the agenda, the Bylaw 2018-14, the Land Use Bylaw Amendment for Peaks Landing. Is there any additions or changes? In which case, I'll move that the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And we'll move right into it. Agenda item B1. That's the Bylaw 2018-14 Land Use Bylaw Amendment for Peaks Landing. Ms. Wojtenko.
Thank you. Good morning, Council and Mayor. I'm here to present again the second time that we brought second reading back for the Peaks Landing Land Use Bylaw Amendment 2018-14. We were here in February as well, and the motion was to postpone. And we provided a recommendation in the staff report, which was to give second and third reading to the bylaw. We are going to put forward an amended motion that Council give only second reading to Bylaw 2018-14 as amended, and that Council postpone third reading to May 7th, 2019. And we'll provide the reasons for this change to the recommendation as we go through the presentation. So the site that we're talking about is Area B, Plan 9412236, in the Peaks of Grassy area. It's a single parcel of land, however, is broken up into three separate parts or portions. So the Land Use Bylaw Amendment application that was before Council that has received first reading was to change the land use district from UR Urban Reserve to Direct Control District, Public Use District, and R1B Residential Single Family Detached Plus District. And this amendment application was put forward to allow for the development of 27 dwelling units and up to 13 accessory dwelling units, so secondary suites. And this is on 0.04 hectares of land, the remainder of which would be designated as municipal reserve. Here's a map showing the three sites that are proposed for the Direct Control District. And remember, this is what was given first reading by Council in January. And at the public hearing, which was also in January, we received many submissions, and these are available to view online. You can also view the public hearing on our webpage. While there was some support for the application, we did hear significant opposition and concerns. I'm going to provide a quick summary of those concerns. First was the Steep Creek hazard. And although we have prepared a satisfactory report prepared for Stones Canyon Creek, and it does show that there is development, or that there is a yellow, which is the low hazard zone, on a portion of this lot. And the report does show that development and our land use bylaw and our municipal development plan do allow for development in a low hazard zone with simply local design mitigations. And those local design mitigations include things such as raising the grade of the lot, increasing the height of the foundation, and being mindful of where you place the openings, such as doors, garages, and windows on the development. In addition to the local on-site mitigations, the report stated that we could do additional off-site mitigations, which would be in the form of either a berm or a wall. And that would protect not only the new development, but existing development in Peaks of Grassy as well. The design and construction of the berm is something that we would discuss with the applicant at subdivision. There was a wildfire report done, and it provided recommendations for reducing the wildfire threat. And these recommendations were addressed through both vegetation management done on the site, as well as some mitigations proposed in the land use district. There were concerns about traffic, and the assessment that came forward from the engineers is that the road design is capable of handling the increase in traffic. But there is a design solution to address, and this is even existing safety considerations. And the primary mitigation would be to reduce the speed limit in the local area to 30 kilometers per hour. And I will speak to this later, but in addition, to address the traffic issues, the applicant has proposed to reduce the number of lots on Site 3 from 5 units to 4 units. There is much concern about blasting, and there is not blasting currently proposed by the applicant. There is other ways of removing rock from Site 3, but this is a concern that is addressed at subdivision, not at land use. There are also concerns on wildlife, and the reports of both the environmental impact statement prepared by the applicant as well as the third-party reviewer by the town's own independent third-party reviewer agreed that the consequence of the development on wildlife use and movement will be low, recognizing that there is already a significant impact on wildlife in the area. The consultants said that they had a high level of confidence in the impact assessment as well as the mitigation. So the mitigations that are proposed are, for example, fencing, education, and signage, some of which has already been installed in other areas of Peaks of Grassy by the province. The applicants did state, though, that there is some uncertainty in the report, and this is generally because of individual species and individuals within that species, of their reactions and human behavior and compliance. So we recognize that to protect wildlife, it does take commitment of the town, the province, and the community. There were questions of why cumulative impact assessment was not completed, and through the results of the environmental impact statement, it said that the effects identified in the local area can be mitigated using practical and achievable measures. The town's third-party reviewer agreed with these conclusions, and so therefore a cumulative impacts assessment was not required. There's concerns of the views from Quarry Lake. Similar to the NRCB decision, the boat corridor is not pristine, and the scenic values are not universally held. So the views may change, but it won't be a significant change for the majority of users. And there were comments on the perpetual affordable housing proposed to be provided. Affordable housing is a very complex challenge that's facing Canmore. We continue to have a need for affordable units. And so from this, there is a level of community benefit that is achieved. And at the first application, there was an agreement prepared between the applicant and CCHC to provide 7 units of PH on Site 1. The settlement agreement does further address the PH. So the settlement agreement, which was created in 1998, is an agreement between council and the Three Sisters. Council is not bound by this agreement. Council can choose to follow it, but council is not bound by it. The settlement agreement does state that there should be no more than a certain number of units, which is 404, and a certain area of land, and then there's no further development beyond that. Unless that development comes forward as what's called community housing. And although community housing isn't defined in the settlement agreement, I think the intent is towards PAH. So council could choose to uphold the settlement agreement and not allow further development unless that is provided as PH or community housing. And just as a note, there is no current ability through the Municipal Government Act for council to require affordable housing. Inclusionary housing provisions have been added to the Municipal Government Act. However, they have not been proclaimed, so it's not yet a tool that municipalities can use. Secondary suites. There was concerns about how secondary suites would be occupied. The town, however, cannot enforce or regulate who occupies a suite. But they do provide an opportunity for market affordable housing to residents. There was concerns about the SSR, the impacts and the benefits. We recognize that the SSR is not a perfect tool. However, it does provide another mechanism for council to evaluate the impacts of an application or a development. So this SSR showed very high benefits because of the 7 PAH units. And lastly, there was some concern on the impact of the adjacent neighbors, and these were mostly with the rear yard setbacks and the setbacks to existing homes. And it is a reality that that site is constrained by topography. So in summary, all of the technical reports that we did receive confirm that while actions or mitigations may be required, but there is no real technical reason or planning reason why the lands could not be developed. So these concerns do not prevent Council from approving this application on its merits. But you do need to look at the balance between the interests of the community who opposes the development, affordable needs, and rights of the applicant as a landowner. So I'm going to speak to these rights quickly. When administration receives an application for land use amendment, there is a right to procedural fairness, both for the applicant and for the public. And only Council has the authority to decide on a land use bylaw amendment. And so to receive approval through Council, that requires 3 readings and a public hearing and advertisement. We've had first reading, we've advertised the public hearing, and had the public hearing to address that procedural fairness. I'm going to skip that. So in discussions with the applicant since the public hearing and the postponement of second reading, the applicant has returned to administration with some proposed amendments to the bylaw, and I would like to present these. So the first proposed amendment is to remove the R1B district from the area around Site 3. So there was that little strip of green R1B, and that has been removed. And so the entire area of Site 3 is proposed to be direct control. Further amendments would be on Site 3 to reduce the number of single-family dwellings allowed from 5 units to 4, to increase the widths of lots from 15 meters, and the area of the lot would be a minimum of 450 meters squared. So in essence, you would get 4 larger lots, and there wouldn't be a strip of land added to the adjacent lot. As well, you'd increase the side yard setback adjacent to existing dwellings, so that's on the most extreme east and west ends of Site 3. That setback would be increased from 1.5 meters to 3 meters. And to increase the rear yard setback from 7.5 meters to 13.5 meters. And finally, there would be a typographical error corrected for the townhouse parking, which is the 2 units, or 2 bedrooms, is 1.5 units, or 1.5 stalls, sorry, and 3 to 4 bedrooms would be 2 stalls. And one other thing that is not part of the direct control district, but is a consideration for Council in deciding on the application, is that an amendment agreement has been provided, and it is in your package. That's between the applicant and CCHC. And this isn't a formal signed agreement yet, a purchase and sale agreement. It is an offer to purchase. And the offer is for CCHC to purchase the entirety of Site 1, therefore resulting in 14 PAH units being provided. And the details of that purchase and sale agreement are still being negotiated. And it is for that reason that administration is recommending, should Council give second reading today, to postpone third reading until the details of this agreement are solidified. And there's our recommendation, the recommendation again, to give second reading and postpone third reading until May 7th, 2019.
Can I just ask a question at this point, Ms. Wojtenko? So in regards to this second agreement that you referenced, if that should prove unsuccessful for any reason, the current agreement that's been signed by CCHC would stand, am I correct?
So that's a bit of a complicated question. So if an agreement is signed between the developer and CCHC, a new agreement, then the language in that would essentially indicate that the new agreement supersedes any previous agreement. So essentially, the previous agreement would be null and void, and the current agreement would be what would be in force. So therefore, if for some reason council failed to give third reading or second reading to the bylaw, then it wouldn't automatically revert back to the previous agreement. So if no new agreement is signed between CCHC and the developer, conversely, assuming that they agreed to have the existing agreement remain in force, then yes, that could remain an option. But that would require a discussion between CCHC and the developer to determine whether or not they chose to do so.
If the bylaw is approved without any amendments, though, then at the very least the original agreement would be in place.
Not necessarily. So if the bylaw, so we're proposing, or we're recommending to council that you give second reading and not third reading in order for them to, CCHC and the developer to have time to finalize their agreement. If they finalize that agreement, then it's the new agreement that comes into force. If they don't finalize that agreement and the bylaw as it is currently proposed is passed, then yes, there's an opportunity for the existing agreement to still be an option. But it depends entirely on a number of variables, including what council decides to do and how the developer and CCHC respond to the decision of council. So there is no certainty that if this passes as is, that you would have the option to revert back to the initially proposed agreement.
Which is why the recommendation is to hold off till third reading.
That is correct. So that essentially what we're recommending is that council give an indication of their intent with second reading, and then that provides CCHC and the developer certainty with which to move forward and to finalize the direction that they wish to pursue.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McCallum, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused. So,
Me too.
Why are we here then? Frankly,
Yeah. So
the reason why I'm here is to make a decision on this land use change, and a giant piece of that puzzle has to do with that discussion between CCHC and the developer.
So first and foremost, we're here because council set a date
Yeah,
of
no, I
reconsidering
understand
this
that.
to today's date.
Fair statement.
So administration has no choice but to execute on the will of council. So that's first and foremost. Second of all, there is and has been provided in the agenda package essentially the letter of intent or the offer to purchase between the developer and CCHC that sets out the conditions of which they are working to agree. There was some expectation that they would have had the actual purchase and sale agreement finalized in time for this discussion. Unfortunately, that has not taken place. However, council proceeding with second reading, if that is their intent, but holding off on third reading gives, again, CCHC and the developer certainty in terms of the direction that they are going, so they can also move to finalize that agreement. Because, again, the updated agreement is dependent upon council approving the land use as it is proposed here. So if there are any changes that are made by council, then that would need to be considered by the parties. So I would actually still argue that there is a good reason for council to be considering this. You know the details of the agreement between CCHC and the developer because they have provided those.
But what I don't know is that it's assured.
You're correct. You don't know that it's assured,
Yeah.
and nor do they until they know which direction council is
But
moving.
they came to us, we didn't go to them.
So,
I'm just pointing it out, I'm kind of confused. It's a Tuesday morning.
yeah, but
Don't
so
have
once
enough
again,
coffee.
we were required to bring
Yeah,
back
no, I
the amendment at this.
understand that, I guess, but we could have, if we've known for a while that this was unfolding, could we not have?
So this is the first council meeting that was available to us, so there was no other option. Only council can change the date of the
Right.
consideration of a meeting, right? And so we haven't known for some time, so the CCHC and the developer have been working to finalize an agreement, basically, essentially, since the public hearing where the developer came to the conclusion that some amendments were going to be appropriate in order to move forward with the development. So we haven't known for some time. There is no, that the agreement or an agreement between them would be changed or would not be finalized in time for this meeting.
We have or we haven't known
We
that?
have not known.
Okay, when did we find this out?
Essentially yesterday.
Okay, all right.
Just as a note, Councillor.
Thank
Of
you.
course, it's council's prerogative at any time. At this time, if we prefer to put forward postponing motion on second reading, if that's council's preference.
Yep. I was just trying to understand where I didn't understand. Thank you very much.
Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have another question for you before you sit down. We have an agreement in our agenda package.
Yes.
That's all signed with initials, et cetera.
Yes.
So I understood that that's where we're at. Now, what is missing?
So the agreement that is in your agenda package is essentially an offer to purchase, and it sets out the conditions of which that offer to purchase would be executed under. However, it is not an actual purchase and sale agreement. So what is required still is a follow-up, essentially, agreement, which is the actual purchase and sale agreement, which will have all kinds of additional details related to the transfer of the land, obligations as it relates to conditions around subdivision, the cost sharing around things like waste and recycling location, those types of details. So the purchase and sale agreement is a much more detailed agreement than the offer to purchase, which is what is in your agenda package.
Okay. I have another question. Maybe it's for Ms. Wojtenko. You mentioned that the berm that was proposed to be built as part of this project would protect existing housing as well?
Yes, that's
Can you give us an idea of how that would happen? Considering that we've had some flood events in Peaks of Grassy in the 2012, 2013.
So this is a map showing Stones Creek, or Stones Canyon Creek. And so you can see down here, just it's kind of the distal lateral fan. So this is where the development site is. Existing development in Peaks of Grassy that is currently impacted is here. But there's also, and so the berm that we're proposing, or that has been proposed by the consultant, would be located somewhere around here. And it would come up and help protect some existing development. But there is also XYZ creeks, which the town studied, and there's additional, I think they're on here yet, additional retaining walls proposed. There's already quite a few retaining walls in Peaks of Grassy, and they did quite a good job during the 2013 flood. But the consultant has looked at it and said, you could do more to protect existing development on X, Y, and Z, and that's what the study, I think you were just presented that in January as well.
Yeah, I assume that those were two different things, because the walls that are currently in Peaks of Grassy are the ones that protected at the 2013 flood, right?
The ones
Yeah.
that are currently, yes.
Yeah, so
But
there's
this-
already some mitigation in there.
Yes, not on the homes that are impacted by Stones Canyon Creek, though. So this would provide the mitigation on those homes.
And
Existing
those are
homes.
those are already built, but they're not part of this subdivision.
That's correct.
Okay. But they didn't have any impact in 2013? Those homes weren't necessarily impacted?
I don't believe those ones were, no.
Okay. So that's why I'm kind of mystified that this berm is going to protect houses that weren't impacted in a high event in the past.
So as with all of the hazard studies that we have done, we've looked at the maximum possible event, which is generally the 1,000 to 3,000 year event. And so yes, there were some homes in Cougar Creek, for example, that were not impacted, but in the hazard studies show that in the maximum event, it could happen. 2012, when the flood happened, we thought, wow, that was big. And then when 2013 happened, we said, holy crap, were we wrong about 2012? And so we can't always think that 2013 is the maximum event.
Right.
Much worse have happened in the past.
Yet the flood mitigation that's being proposed is at a lower level than what, there's option 2 and option 3.
Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering about that.
So the exact location of the off-site mitigation that is being proposed, again, as Ms. Wojtenko showed, would run high enough up that it would protect both the existing, or some of the existing, much of the existing, and the new development. from that creek. Right? So it was deliberately being considered and designed to add both of those components, for both existing and the new development. Having said that, and as we have indicated previously, that offsite mitigation is not required for this land use consideration. Whether first of all, the MDP and our regulations allow for development in yellow zones with on-site mitigations only. This was an additional level of protection that was essentially proposed because it had a dual benefit of protecting both the existing and the new development. It is not required for the new development. Through the local on-site mitigation, all the protections that are required for that can be accomplished. So it is whether or not the off-site mitigation will move forward will be finalized at the subdivision phase and is not really a factor for this decision around land use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. How do we distinguish this fan or this image of debris flow from a floodway? What's the definition of floodway versus the debris flow footprint?
So a floodway is generally described actually for the valley bottom, for the river, as opposed to for the steep creek, which we were talking about, essentially the fan and the debris flood area.
And so it's not considered a floodway?
It is not considered a floodway.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Did you have more in your report, Ms. Wojtenko? Okay.
Very quick to be done. So the alternatives for council, as Councillor McCallum also pointed out, is that we could postpone second reading again. And again, we have picked a date that would be available for council, which is May 7th, 2019. You could also propose further amendments to the bylaw. And again, administration would recommend only providing second reading and postponing third reading so that the applicant and CCHC can further consider these changes. You could also give second and third reading without amendments, or you could refuse second reading. So any other questions?
Councillor McCallum, did you have a question?
Sure. So I understand that the proposal has changed from 5 single-family homes to 4. Could you, and that was to address the concern with regards to traffic. I understand that there's a different way that you can now get out of your driveway based on how that's configured. Could somebody outline for me how that is now meant to work?
Well,
please?
I mean, there is an option with the wider lots that potentially you could have a driveway that would be a drive-in, drive-out. But the way that and we did have McElhaney, the engineering department, analyze the concerns, the traffic concerns, and it was recognized that there is already an existing concern there, and there isn't a traffic problem, but there is potentially a safety concern, which was agreed by the engineers that that could be reduced by reducing the speed limit in the area by to 30 kilometers per hour.
Which is something that we're actually proposing
Yes.
within our transportation master plan throughout town.
Yeah.
So the rear yard setback has now been aligned with the other homes in the neighborhood. That's what's being proposed.
That's correct.
And the side yard setback's been increased on either side of those single-family homes to protect the new housing from the old housing in case of fire.
It's not for a fire concern.
Oh,
no, it's
okay.
not a fire concern. It's like the building code addresses fire concerns,
Right.
either through setbacks or through building construction materials. The extra width is just recognizing that there are existing homes in that area. And in the first application that came forward back in 2013, there was a municipal reserve proposed on the western side. With the second and this third application, there was additional land provided to the other side. So the applicant just decided, let's give a bit of land
Everybody
on
some more
both
breathing
sides.
room.
Yeah.
Excellent. I had a constituent raise concern about the height of the housing on that rocky spot and how that would be calculated by the town. So I know that that's a subdivision question, but are there any general rules with regards to how the height will be calculated from a land use perspective?
Yep, so through the land use bylaw, we determine how a building height is calculated. And so that's generally by grades, and we have a couple of different formulas that you can use to calculate your height. But at subdivision, what happens is we require the developer to do a grading plan.
Okay.
And so through works that would be required on this site to develop the land, so removal of rock, and still get appropriate drainage, we would ask the developer to prepare a grading plan. And from that grading plan, there would be points determined, and that's where you would measure your building height from.
Okay. So the concern was more around the highest part of the rocky area could end up being the basement, the floor of the basement of a home. Is that at all possible?
No, I believe that there's going to be a significant amount of rock removed to bring the grades to a developable level. Yeah.
Okay. And then,
and secondly,
sorry.
those homes are proposed with slab on grade. There will not be a basement.
Right, there'll be a main floor,
Yep.
which, depending on whether you're at the back of the house or the front of the house, will depend on whether it's a basement or not really,
Yeah.
colloquially, yeah. So should we, Your Worship, ask questions about what's proposed in the CCHC agreement? If it's not sure, if it's not solidified yet?
I think for council's, to help council balance the decision between the community benefit and the larger public interest versus the impact of the local residents, those agreements are germane. They're certainly not part of a land use decision.
Okay, all right. They aren't germane, sorry.
No, I mean, land use is only land use.
Okay, so I shouldn't ask any questions about the,
So if I might,
at this
if
time.
the existence of the agreement is informing council's decision, then we would say that it is germane. So if you have questions, we can answer those to the best of our ability.
Okay, all right. So there is a concern in the community, and I understand how PAH works, but that somehow these units, especially with this new agreement, that these units are going to become a liability on the local ratepayer or local citizens. And I think that there's an understanding that some of this flood protection is incredibly expensive, because we're seeing, you know, $48 million price tags for what we're doing in Cougar Creek and so on and so forth. And I suspect that people are drawing a line and saying, well, it's going to be very expensive to insert this flood mitigation in this new development. So I want to understand if the $275 a square foot that we budget for our PAH projects will encapsulate all of these expenses like any other developer would.
Mr. Fargo, just note that if
Mr. Fortieth
if
is
we want to
here.
hear from CCHC, Mr. Fortieth.
Is also here? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can speak to the mitigation components. So once again, the offsite mitigation here, we have done an initial concept design, and the budget for that is relatively modest. We're not talking the $48 million that we're looking at for Cougar Creek debris flood retention structure. It's in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $150,000 for this type of infrastructure.
Yep.
It is a fairly simple earthen berm, deflection berm. And Mr. Fortieth can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that CCHC would be acquiring the land for essentially the cost of the studies that were required to ensure that the land was developable, and that CCHC would have therefore the access to those studies. And so in that case, essentially the CCHC is paying for the studies and not for the land. I would believe the expectation then, and Mr. Fortieth, you can comment, is that the 275 should be sufficient to cover the costs of this development, and that the cost of the on-site mitigation, raising the grade, having the foundation slightly higher, those would not materially impact the cost to construct.
I wouldn't expect that from my experience in construction, but I just want to confirm that and have that public conversation.
We can only confirm what Mr. Fark has said,
Perfect.
that we feel it would be included.
So we expect that that $275 a square foot will encapsulate all the on-site and off-site costs included, so there will be no.
That's correct.
Perfect. Thank you very kindly.
Any other questions, Councillor? Good. Councillor O'Meara?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. I had just a couple questions. One, with the CCHC agreement that's being proposed, is there a time frame in there anywhere that says that CCHC has to build within a certain time frame? Building commitment, I guess it's called.
So that was a component that was discussed, and my understanding is that there is no time requirement on CCHC. So if CCHC acquires the land, then it will be up to the CCHC at the timing and form that any building will take. So they will have to look at their long-term planning and decide when it might make sense for them to move forward with the development.
Okay. And then question 2 is regarding, it's in the settlement agreement and applies to density. There's 404 units were suggested. Does that include secondary suites?
No, it does not. So the 404 units were the primary units. Secondary suites are not counted in that.
And do we know how many secondary suites, legal secondary suites we have?
In Peaks of Grass?
In Peaks of Grass?
No, I don't believe we have an accurate count at this time, and there are some suites in there that are likely not permitted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Comfort?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. So a couple of my questions were already answered, actually more than a couple. But I do have a question about that 404 units. That does not include community housing.
That's correct. Community housing is excluded.
Is there any community housing currently built up there?
In Peaks of Grass, no, there's not.
And the other question I had, a couple other questions about, excuse me, wildfire and the ABC, the Alberta Building Code.
Mm-hmm.
Significant changes were made over the last 20 years, I believe, that contribute to safety in conditions of wildfire. Would that be correct, or is that?
The Alberta Building Code doesn't actually address wildfire. It deals with structure-to-structure fire.
Oh, okay. So the actual components of the building weren't addressed in that?
So through the building code, yes, it does address structure-to-structure fire. So it deals with, for example, when you have a structure next to each other, how far apart those structures have to be. And if they're within a certain distance, they'll like a limiting distance, then they have to have smaller windows, smaller openings. They might not have openings. The siding needs to be constructed differently. The entire wall system needs to be constructed differently. How
about shingles and roofs and so forth?
That's not part of the building code, but we do regulate through the land use bylaw, our own land use bylaw.
Oh, okay. And let's see. So there was a concern expressed in the community about evacuation and the number of people up there, and that if we were to develop more, that would complicate evacuation plans for that. Can somebody in administration comment on that?
So once again, when the subdivision was designed, it was designed with a primary access and egress, and then there was a secondary one that was built in as well. It is a gravel road that exits out into the Windmark development and then directly onto Highway 742. So the traffic studies that have been done confirm that that is sufficient, that meets the requirements for emergency exit, and that the incremental increase of this number of units does not change that equation. So the addition of this number of units does not change the function of those roads.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Worship. I just want to make sure that what I heard was correct about the berm. You mentioned that the berm was going to cost in the range of $150,000 as proposed.
That is correct.
But you can build this PAH project without the berm.
That is correct.
And the intent is to cost in the berm into the front end of this development?
So that would be a decision at subdivision between whoever the owner of that site is and the town. So what is currently in place is the town budgeted a certain amount of money, I believe it was $80,000 in our budget, to cost share up to 50% of the cost of the berm, and that was for the protection of the existing development, and then the new development would have to pay for their share of the to protect the new development. So if the decision was made to go ahead with the berm and CCHC were to acquire Site 1, then they would need to build in the cost of their share of the berm into their cost to construct. And so their cost would be in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $80,000.
And that berm doesn't need to be built right away, so...
That is correct.
Yeah.
The berm does not need to be built right away, and it does not need to be built as a condition of allowing the development to proceed.
But that money would be collected at the upfront part of this development?
No. So the town would only move forward with the construction of the berm if it was decided to do so, and then the funds required to pay for that would be collected at the time the decision is made to actually move forward with the construction.
But it's built into the front-end cost. See, what I'm concerned about is that when you plan a new subdivision, the mitigation cost should be part of that. Like the mitigation cost should be in the beginning of it.
So,
because it's hard to come back and get it later.
So through the Municipal Government Act, we are allowed to take funds for things like utilities, various construction, at either subdivision or development. So we could take it through the subdivision or at development permit application. There are two opportunities. But you're correct, we can't come back after the subdivision is done or after the development is done and ask for the money.
Right. And I thought I heard you say that cost was going to be built into the cost of the PAH.
So no, what I said was that if whoever owns Site 1 wants to move forward with development on Site 1, and the decision is taken at subdivision that the off-site mitigation is required, then they will have to pay their share of that cost. And if that were to be CCHC, then they would have to factor into that into their $275 a square foot.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that clarity.
Councillor Hillstead.
Thank you. With the rock removal from Site 3, do we know if they will be trucking the rock out, keeping the rock as infill, or basically what they're going to do with the rock?
My understanding is that would need to be trucked out. Oh, you'd crush it and use it for infill? On-site. On-site crushing, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Are there other questions this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation. So then at this point I will put forward the second reading of Bylaw 2018-14 as amended. And I'll speak to the motion to give second reading to the bylaw. And I'll acknowledge that this has been as difficult a period of time as it was the last time we heard a similar application, and certainly as difficult or more so than the process council went through on Hawks Bend and the daycare lands. It's when communities are divided in a way that these sorts of applications or developments occur, it's tough on everybody. But with this new application, I was determined to put everything that happened behind and reconsider this as a new application, which I've done. I've certainly listened to the voices in the community. I've read, I think, everything that's come to council and the reports. I've heard the voices, and I understand the concerns. From a planning perspective, it seems to me that given the reports that we've had from a number of expert consultants in regards to flood risk and wildlife concerns, the environmental impact statement and the independent third-party review, there's nothing in those reports that would not suggest that it's reasonable development from a planning perspective. That's a separate perspective than community perspective. And I take to heart the direction that council always works under, which is within the Municipal Government Act, and that's where council gets its marching orders, if you will. And the section in the Municipal Government Act that's referenced in the report, it speaks about maintain and improving the quality of the physical environment within which patterns of human settlements are situated in Alberta without infringing on the rights of individuals, and clearly that's at play here, for any public interest except to the extent that is necessary for the overall greater public interest. And from my perspective, and I think most of council's perspective, that's the real crux of this discussion, is the overall greater public interest, the greater community benefit to be had from the perpetually affordable housing, the affordable homes that would result from this development. Does the benefit to the community supersede the admittedly direct negative impact to the residents? And from my perspective, it does. I appreciate that this is very difficult for the residents to have happening in their lives and to look forward to if this bylaw should be approved. And again, it really reminds me directly of the experience we went through, well, still going through actually, 7 years now in the Hawks Bend development. It was, I have good friends in that neighborhood who are still devastated by the fact that there's a change in their neighborhood, and instead of looking out at the field across the road, they're looking at homes. But I take I'm happy that these families that are moving into Hawks Bend now have a home to move into. And I've talked with a number of the new residents in that area, and these are folks that often grew up in Canmore and really didn't have an option they couldn't see a way of staying in Canmore to raise their own family. But that's changed for the folks that have been able to buy a unit at Hawks Bend. A good example for me, a personal example, is a couple that I know in Canmore, and they've lived here for a number of years, and they're working, contributing members of the community. In fact, the husband works for the town, and they had 2 young daughters, and the daughter's in elementary school now, so 7 or 8, somewhere in there. When their daughters were born, they wanted to have a home of their own, and they tried for 3 years to find a place in Canmore and gave up and moved to Cochrane. And they're really unhappy about having to leave Canmore, and they kept working here and commuting from Cochrane to Canmore. And then when Hawks Bend came along, they applied and were successful in getting a home there, and they're moving back to Canmore, and those are the kind of people that we need to keep in Canmore. The fabric of our community is torn. I mean, it's been tearing for years, and some in the community don't agree with me on that, but that's my belief. We can't have a full, balanced community when housing is, well, about the most expensive housing in the country. How can young families imagine having a life here? If I moved to Canmore today as a young potter with young family, I would be moving on within days. I appreciate that that the amendment was made to Site 3. I think that's a good response to what was heard at the public hearing and through other voices. I recognize that Site 3 doesn't bring what we would refer to as a community benefit. It's those, if this is approved and there's 4 homes built there, those are likely to be owned second or third homes. They may not be homes where people live full-time in Canmore and raise their family. I appreciate that. But they'll be beautiful homes, I'm certain, and built to the same standards as the other homes in that neighborhood. So for me, it really does entirely come down to accepting that there's a negative impact to the neighborhood, but that the overall community benefit and the overall greater public interest is well served by providing affordable housing for our community in that neighborhood. So I would be supporting second reading at this time. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, this has been a very difficult process, and I guess I'll put my perspective on it. The seller of these lands and purchasers knew of the settlement agreement. The residents, builders, and realtors consistently indicated and seemed to genuinely understand these lands would remain in an undeveloped state, with referencing the settlement agreement. I walked the site again and found sites 1 and 2 reasonable for development and consideration. Site 3, however, has a natural rock outcrop, geological feature, and is beautiful as is. So in walking Site 3, it caused me a great concern about the development vision and zoning. At the recent public hearings, the urban reserve zoning was discussed for all 3 parcels. I'm troubled by the Site 3 being developed and the UR designation. So I'd like to propose an amendment.
Do you have it for the overhead?
We're on the overhead. So the amendment will be Site 3 in the entire eastern portion of the lot remain an urban reserve district. Remove references of Site 3 from the DC district in sections 6.39.3, 6.39.4, and 6.39.6.8a townhouse parking.
Councillor Sanford, you have your button. Are you speaking to the amending motion? Okay. At some point, okay. Well, I guess I'll speak somewhat.
Can we have some questions first?
Yes, Councillor McCallum.
McCallum. I know it's been a month. Me. So is it your understanding that Site 3 is attached to those 2 acres of land that sit behind it, and that would therefore also be removed from the equation?
Yes.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure that that's understood. And is it also understood that and I guess I'm kind of confused as to where we are right now, because we sort of have a tentative offer over here as to what's happening on Site 1. I've had a hard time with 1 and 3, as you all know. And so this just makes it all the more confusing. Okay. Because it's my understanding from the original contract that was signed between CCHC and the developer that if there were any changes made to the proposed plan, that those units would no longer be PAH.
So you're,
So what, I'm just trying to understand what your long game is here.
Well, if this is successful, then we'd likely postpone second reading and work through all those details, what that looks like, if it's acceptable to the applicant.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Councillor Seeley, if I understand what you just said, your reasoning for wanting to remove Site 3 from the bylaw is that, as you said, Site 3 is beautiful as is. And I don't think anybody's denying that any of the undeveloped land up there is beautiful as is. I mean, that's been part of the residents' concern for some time, is that they prefer the beauty of the undeveloped forested land. So how is it that Site 3, the beauty of Site 3 is different than the Site 1 and 2?
I'll speak to it just to give you some perspective on that. So Site 3, left in its natural state, protects an important and relevant geological feature. Many of the concerns at the public hearing were about Site 3, traffic, blind spots, blasting, and significant disruption of rock removal. The settlement agreement also indicates that additional housing must be community housing. R1B single-family housing does not fit this intent. So Site 1 with 14 PEH units are needed, an important community need. Site 2 with 8 duplex with mandatory suites, again, fits my definition of community housing. And I'm just troubled with any development on Site 3 and interested to hear from my colleagues. Protecting this geological feature from future development, I believe, will best serve the community.
So your concern is not so much around the beauty of the site, it's that the 4 units that might be built there are not addressing a community need? I like the site as it is. I walk the site and it's nice, and if it's left in that state, I think it would be a benefit to the community. And the R1 housing doesn't fit the community housing in the settlement agreement for me. Anybody care to speak to the amending motion? Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. If we are proposing to postpone third reading, I would be inclined to uphold this amendment, because that way the developer or the landowner could consider the next step in negotiating with CCHC. If this is a consideration for them, that this piece of property needs to be developed, then that would be the conversation with CCHC. So I understand that any changes that council makes will impact the landowner and their future considerations. So if we propose such an amendment at second reading and give the landowner that opportunity to consider it and revise their proposal for third reading, I mean, that would be a consideration. So I would consider upholding it, just from the issues that have been raised over the rock outcrop on Site 3. So I would support your amendment.
Councillor Comfort.
So, thank you. I think that I need to better understand the consequences of this amendment, because my understanding is that if significant changes are made to the bylaw, that would then negate any sales agreement, and that's what we'd be putting at risk. So that concerns me, because my support for this bylaw lies in the PAH happening and the community housing, and also the other Site 2 as well. So I'd hate to see that be put at risk. And also I wonder about, are we on murky legal ground here? I mean, it sort of seems like a backhanded attempt at expropriation or something. I don't know, maybe not.
No, but the land is zoned UR right now. There's an application to change the zoning. If that zoning is not changed through this bylaw, then that's okay. I mean, that in law, there's no obligation to include Site 3.
So then but then developers could walk away from all of it and just develop it as, I don't know, that's what I don't know. I don't know what the options then are.
Under current zoning,
They
there
can't.
could be no well,
Yeah.
there's some discretionary potential campgrounds and
Campgrounds,
cemeteries and
cemeteries.
whatnot, but
Yeah.
yeah, so
Kennels.
housing can't be developed under the UR
Right.
zoning.
So I guess I'm saying I would find it difficult to support the amendment, but I don't have any problem with delaying third reading to see where it goes. To see what we're actually making a decision on. I don't feel like we have that at the moment.
Councillor Seeley?
I think the intent of my motion is to delay second reading, to give the applicant and everyone an opportunity to see what that might do.
But that's not what your amendment suggests.
I would have another amendment to delay second reading.
Delay third reading?
Second reading.
So postpone second reading
Postpone
today?
second reading today.
Uh,
But I'd take administration's guidance on that.
So if we might offer some clarification here. If Councillor Seeley's amendment passes, the recommendation of administration would be to give the bylaw second reading so that the amendment is captured and considered valid,
Yeah.
and then to postpone third reading, as was the original recommendation, which was to postpone third reading, so that the consequence of the decision of council can be understood by the applicant and CCHC and taken into consideration, and that any consequence of that decision then can be brought back to council for their consideration at third reading. Does that clarify the situation for council?
Yeah, I think it'd be odd to approve an amendment and not, well, you have to approve it at the second reading.
Okay.
So it'd be a different motion if you wanted to move postponing second reading at this time, but I don't think that's what you're saying.
No. I understand better now.
Yeah. So I struggle supporting your amending motion, Councillor. I think that's something that could perhaps come back for discussion and be changed at third reading. But, you know, in Alberta, we're very limited in how we can get the private sector to take part in providing affordable housing. We can't force it. We can only bring affordable housing from the private sector to our community by working with the developer, and it's a fact that developers need to make profit. It would be wonderful if the original landowner had simply handed the town the land and given it to us, but even with land that we did own to begin with at the Hawks Bend, there's still costs associated to the land. My preference at this point would be to give second reading to the bylaw as proposed, with the amendments proposed, and see where it is at third reading. Give the developer and CCHC an opportunity to continue to consider options for Site 1, so council knows with certainty at third reading what exactly might transpire on the lands after approval's been given. That's my preference, so I won't support your amending motion. Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Worship. You had mentioned that there's a concern about removing this aspect of the development. I think in the modified proposal that has come forward, which is to sell the land to CCHC and have CCHC put the costs in for flood mitigation, has actually separated that what I was considering to be an offset by the developer to develop somewhere else on the property and then put money into Site 1. So at this point in time, the landowner is considering removing Site 1 from the package and having a cash transaction for that land for the purpose of CCHC. But I don't see the necessity to develop Site 3 to offset the cost of Site 1 at this point in time because of the change in the application. So the reason that I would uphold this amendment is because now the developer in CCHC could negotiate based on this offset not being there because it's not necessary because there's a cash transaction. So that's why I would consider to uphold this. The proposal has changed quite significantly from the first reading. So at second reading, if we put in an amendment like this, then CCHC and the landowner can consider the ramifications of it. Because if it's a cash transaction now, then it's not required to sell more land to offset the cost of that. That would be my perspective.
Councillor McCallum?
A question to the clerk, actually, on procedure. If council approves second reading with this amendment, can this amendment be pulled out for third?
Yes, at third reading, you're still able to make as many amendments as you want.
Right.
Before passing third reading.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
While we have the mic, sorry, Cheryl Hyde has identified that the references that Councillor Seeley has provided are incorrect. If the intent is to remove references to Site 3, the sections should be 6.39.2 and 6.39.4. There is no reference to Site 3 in 6.39.6.8a. Townhouse parking is not a reference to Site 3. Unless there's a...
And I'll just acknowledge that it was administration that provided those sections to Councillor Seeley this morning, so it was our quick read of the bylaw. That's what we thought. Upon closer inspection, it's those two sections that reference Site 3.
Okay. Is there other discussion, debate from council on the amending motion? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. So prior to this amendment coming forward, I guess I know that a lot of people have read about what inclusionary zoning is and everything else. But what we're seeing happen on the ground is kind of what inclusionary zoning is going to look like when it's passed in Alberta. This is it. It's like a horse trade, to be perfectly frank. And so I think that we have to recognize that when we change pieces of the puzzle, that we change the entire context of the application. So I am disappointed that I don't have all the information required to make a third reading decision today. However, I understand why. And I am going to support this amendment only so that we narrow down to what discussions we're actually going to be having with the developer and whether removing that site is even an option within the overall Tetris puzzle, the Rubik's Cube of this development. I have not fully made up my mind on the final decision for third reading because, quite frankly, we need to do this now because there is no fourth reading, right? So, and we all know how democracy is quite messy. So I'm going to support this amendment. I'm going to support second reading in principle at this point until I see what the final deal is, and then I will make a decision based on that final deal. But I don't want anyone to think that because I'm supporting second reading, I'm necessarily going to support third, because that's not necessarily the case. And that's what I have to say.
Further discussion on the amending motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question on the amendment that's on the overhead. Those in favor? Opposed? So motion's carried with myself and Councillor Mara in opposition. And that will bring us back to second reading of the bylaw as amended. So discussion again on second reading of the bylaw. Is there any discussion on the bylaw? Councillor Comfort?
So I will support second reading for much the same reasons that Councillor McCallum so articulately expressed. And also because I want to see where it goes. Like, we have to keep going. I want to see what the deal will be with the PH, with CCHC, and the only way to get there is to support this because we need to giddy up. So I will support second reading.
Anybody else care to speak to the second reading of the bylaw? I've certainly spoken my piece, and I won't speak again. I'll be supporting the second reading. In which case, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried with Councillor Mara in opposition. And that's all of the business the council has today. Pardon me? Oh yeah, postponement of third reading, sorry. And I'll move the council postpone third reading to May the 7th, 2019. Did you want to speak to the date? Okay, May the 7th, what's that? That's some time.
So May 7th is the next regularly scheduled business meeting of council. That is not April 2nd, but essentially the staff reports for April 2nd are already due, so there would not be time for administration to bring forward a third reading on April 2nd, which is why May 7th was selected.
What?
You're always a Tuesday. Oh, sorry.
I mean, arguably, we could schedule a special meeting. I hate to draw it out any longer than necessary. I don't know if we can select a different date for third reading. Can I ask a question? Yes.
So, Your Worship, if we schedule it for May 7th, and between now and the April 2nd meeting, administration comes up with another date, we could arguably at the April 2nd meeting reschedule our motion to postpone, correct?
Yes.
I would say instead of trying to cram an extra date in at this moment, we allow administration a little bit more time to organize that, and then we can use our public media channels to advertise a new date if there happens to be one. That's just my suggestion.
Yes, you're right. At the April 2nd meeting, we could, through motion, reschedule third reading to a special meeting date earlier than May 7th.
As opposed to concerning ourselves with it now.
Ms. DeSoto?
Your Worship, it's Council's prerogative, the date you set for third reading. Administration does not believe we can make April 2nd because of giving the opportunity to the developer and CCHC to consider, especially this new amendment that was never proposed before. However, you do have a committee of the whole scheduled for the 16th of April and a finance committee meeting scheduled for the 23rd of April. So either of those dates you could also schedule a special meeting. And that would give, I would suggest the 23rd of April. It would be the most appropriate date. That would be earlier than May 7th if that was your concern. But May 7th is also an eligible date.
April 23rd, you said?
April the 23rd, it's a Tuesday. You do have a Finance Committee meeting scheduled at 9
So there's a
a.m.?
scheduled meeting at 9 a.m., which would suggest that all members of council are here. You won't be here. Okay. Okay, for now, let's leave it May 7th, and we can reschedule that if necessary through another motion. Okay, then I move the council postpone third reading to May the 7th, 2019. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And now I will move the council be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.